Hello, and welcome to the channel. I'm glad you're here, and I truly appreciate you listening today. If you enjoy the stories, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that the content presented here is purely for entertainment. The stories and theories shared are speculative and not supported by concrete evidence. They're not meant to be taken as factual information, so please keep an open mind and enjoy the tales. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's settle in and enjoy today's stories. Antarctica, the coldest, most desolate place on Earth. A frozen wasteland where the sun sets for months and the ice stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Yet beneath the frozen surface, secrets have been buried for millennia, forgotten by time, or perhaps intentionally left behind. Returning to the continent wasn't part of the plan, not after the last expedition. But then came the message, an unsigned email that appeared without warning. It contained nothing but coordinates deep in the Antarctic interior, far beyond any established research stations, and a single line of text: "There is something beneath the ice. We were wrong to leave it." That message haunted the days that followed. What had been left, and why was it abandoned? The pull was irresistible. The call of the unknown, the chance to uncover something lost to history, proved too strong to ignore. It wasn't long before a team was assembled, experienced researchers, survivalists and specialists, and soon we were flying over the frozen desert, the expanse of ice stretching endlessly beneath us. The journey to the coordinates was grueling. Antarctica had a way of testing not only the body, but the mind. As the days of travel grew longer, the team began to feel the oppressive weight of isolation. There were no landmarks, no signs of life, just endless ice under an endless sky. The cold was unforgiving, gnawing at every inch of exposed skin, and the silence was louder than anything we had ever experienced. The base camp was set up at the coordinates provided in the email. It was a desolate spot, far from any known research site or historical record of exploration. Yet standing there, we felt something strange. It was as if the ground beneath us held a memory, an echo of something that had been long forgotten, waiting beneath the ice. We wasted no time. Using ground-penetrating radar, we began to survey the area, searching for signs of anything unusual. What we found left us speechless. Beneath several meters of solid ice, there was an anomaly, a massive, perfectly circular structure, hundreds of meters wide. It was unlike anything we had ever seen. Whatever it was, it had been there for centuries, maybe longer, and it wasn't natural. Digging into the ice was slow and painstaking work, but after days of drilling, we finally broke through. A cavern lay beneath the ice, far larger than we had anticipated. Warm air seeped through the crack, unusual in this frozen wasteland. We descended carefully, lowering ourselves into the hidden chamber, unsure of what we would find. As our lights flickered on, we were greeted by a sight that took our breath away. The walls of the cavern were carved with intricate patterns, symbols that seemed almost alien in their design. They glowed faintly, casting the room in an eerie light. Whatever civilization had built this place was far more advanced than anything previously known in this region. At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone monolith, covered in the same glowing symbols. It rose up from the floor, its surface smooth and untouched by time. The silence in the chamber was deafening, as if the very air held its breath. We moved cautiously around the structure, trying to decipher the carvings. They didn't match any known language or pattern. And then something caught our eye. A small opening at the base of the monolith. It looked like a doorway, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Against better judgment, we decided to investigate further. The tunnel beyond the opening was narrow and cramped, but it was smooth, clearly constructed with purpose. We followed it deeper into the earth, the air growing warmer as we descended. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the ice and stone around us were absorbing the sound. After what felt like hours, the passage opened into another chamber, larger than the first. But this one was different. The walls were covered in what looked like murals, depicting strange, abstract shapes and figures. Some of the images appeared to show people, or at least something humanoid. They were kneeling before something huge, something that seemed to tower over them like a god. In the center of the room, another structure stood, a strange device, made from a metal we couldn't identify. It was cold to the touch and had no visible controls or markings. But as we approached, the lights on our equipment flickered, and a deep hum began to resonate from within the chamber. Something was waking up. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though we were the only living things in the chamber. As the hum grew louder, the carvings on the walls seemed to shift, like they were moving, alive with an energy that pulsed through the air. One of the team members, Sam, moved closer to the device, trying to make sense of its purpose. Suddenly, without warning, the humming stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic pulse. The metal surface of the device rippled like liquid, and in a moment of panic, Sam stumbled back, knocking into it. The ground trembled. The pulse grew louder, faster, and before we could react, the device emitted a flash of light. It wasn't blinding, but it filled the room, washing over everything like a wave. Then, silence. The hum was gone. The pulse had stopped. Sam stood frozen, staring at the device. I didn't mean to, he stammered, but before he could finish, his body convulsed. His face twisted in pain, and he let out a choked gasp before collapsing to the floor. We rushed to help him, but it was too late. Sam's eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling, but there was no life behind them. He was gone, and whatever had caused his death was still there, lingering in the air. Panic set in, and we quickly decided to leave. But as we turned to head back to the surface, the walls of the chamber shifted. The passageway we had entered through had vanished, replaced by solid stone. We were trapped. The room was growing colder, though the strange warmth from the deeper chambers had never fully disappeared. And then we heard it. Whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. They didn't come from any one direction. They surrounded us, echoing off the walls. The language was unfamiliar, but it felt ancient, heavy with meaning. One by one, the team members started hearing their names being called. First it was Matt, then Julia, then myself. At first, it seemed like an auditory hallucination, a trick of the mind under stress. But the voices knew things. They whispered details from our pasts, secrets we had never spoken aloud. We huddled together, terrified and confused. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter, pulsing with the rhythm of the whispers. Whatever was in this chamber, it was aware of us, and it was reaching out, trying to pull us in. One of the team members, Julia, stood abruptly, as if in a trance, and began walking toward the monolith in the center of the room. We tried to stop her, but her eyes were blank, her movements stiff and unnatural. She pressed her hand to the smooth surface, and before we could reach her, she vanished, pulled into the monolith, as if it had swallowed her whole. The whispers stopped. We were alone again, but the chamber felt different. The air was heavier, almost suffocating, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unseen force. The whispers had taken something from us, first Sam, now Julia, and we couldn't fight it. In the quiet that followed, we realized the truth. This place wasn't a temple or a tomb. It was a prison. The monolith, the device, the carvings, they were all part of something ancient, something buried here to be forgotten. And we had disturbed it. As we frantically searched for another way out, one of the walls shifted, revealing a narrow path that hadn't been there before. Desperate, we followed it, praying it would lead us back to the surface. The air grew colder as we climbed, and the whispers returned, faint but insistent. It was only when we reached the surface that we realized what had changed. The camp was gone. The landscape around us was unfamiliar. The sky a dark, swirling mass of clouds that hadn't been there when we descended. Time itself had shifted, and the world we had left behind was no longer the one we had returned to. We were never meant to find the cavern. Whatever had been hidden beneath the ice, buried for eons, was meant to remain unseen. And now it was free, reaching out into the world beyond its prison. There were only 3 of us left, exhausted, terrified, and unsure of what had just happened. We began the long trek back to the research station. But deep down, we knew the truth. The Antarctica we had returned to was no longer the same. The whispers followed us, growing louder as we traveled, echoing through the cold, empty expanse of ice. Something had changed in the world. Something that had been forgotten for centuries was now awake. And it was only a matter of time before it revealed itself to everyone. In the end, we were simply explorers, curious about the unknown. But some things are better left undiscovered, buried beneath the ice, unseen by human eyes. Because once you awaken the forgotten, there's no way to put it back to sleep. The Russian tundra is unlike any other place on Earth. Desolate, harsh, and punishing, it stretches for thousands of miles, an endless expanse of ice, snow, and wind that howls like a restless spirit. Few venture there willingly, and those who do are often consumed by the isolation. There are stories, though, rumors of strange things buried in the ice, remnants of ancient civilizations and forgotten experiments. But these stories are usually told by the few who return. Our expedition, however, was not one of them. It began with a simple directive. We were tasked with locating an old Soviet research station that had been abandoned in the late 1950s, hidden deep in the tundra near the Ural Mountains. The station had disappeared from maps decades ago, wiped from records, its purpose unknown. But rumors persisted that something had been uncovered out there in the ice, something that made the Soviets abandon the site without explanation. The Russian government had sent us under the guise of geological research, but our true mission was to locate the station and recover anything left behind. Our team was small, 5 of us in total, seasoned researchers, survivalists, and former military personnel. We were no strangers to hostile environments, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found in that frozen wasteland. The journey to the station was brutal. The endless white landscape was disorienting, and the biting cold was relentless. Even the vehicles we had specially outfitted for the terrain struggled as we ventured deeper into the tundra. The wind never stopped, a constant force that seemed to push against us like it wanted us gone. On the second day, the GPS signal started to weaken, and strange interference plagued our equipment. It was as if something in the air was disrupting the signals, though we were hundreds of miles from any known source of interference. We chalked it up to the severe weather conditions and pressed on. We knew we were getting close when we began to see signs of human activity. Half-buried structures, rusted equipment sticking out of the snow like forgotten bones. The first building we found was little more than a skeleton of twisted metal, half collapsed and completely covered in snowdrifts. It looked like a research outpost, but it had been ravaged by time and the elements. The real station was still several kilometers ahead, deeper into the tundra. As we moved forward, an oppressive feeling began to settle over the group. The silence was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt as if the very land around us was holding its breath, waiting. There was no sign of life, no birds, no animals, not even the usual tracks of Arctic hares or foxes that we had seen earlier in the journey. Just the endless, unforgiving ice. On the fourth day, we found it. The station emerged from the snowstorm like a phantom, its silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. It was larger than we expected. Several buildings connected by narrow, covered walkways, all weathered by decades of neglect. The structures were squat and utilitarian, built for function, not comfort. Most of the windows were broken, and the steel walls were corroded by rust and frost. We approached cautiously, unsure of what to expect. There were no signs of life, no movement, and yet something felt wrong. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as we made our way inside the main building. The temperature dropped even lower once we crossed the threshold, and the stale, frozen air hit us like a wall. Inside, everything was eerily preserved. Desks were still littered with papers, as if the researchers had left in a hurry and never returned. The walls were lined with faded Soviet propaganda posters, and old scientific equipment lay scattered across workstations. But there was something else, something unsettling. In the corners of the rooms, strange symbols were etched into the walls, barely visible under the frost. They weren't Cyrillic or any language we recognized. They looked ancient, otherworldly. We split up to explore the station, but it wasn't long before things started to feel off. The further we ventured into the depths of the facility, the more the temperature seemed to plummet. The walkways between the buildings were narrow and claustrophobic, and every sound we made seemed to echo for miles. Then, the power came back on. It happened without warning. One moment, we were moving through the darkened hallways, our flashlights barely cutting through the gloom. The next, the lights flickered and buzzed to life, casting the station in a sickly yellow glow. The generators, long dormant, hummed back to life with an unnatural mechanical groan. None of us had touched the power systems. None of us had even been near the generator room. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other in confusion. Then the radios crackled with static, a deep, guttural sound that didn't sound like interference. It was a voice, low and unintelligible, speaking in a language we couldn't understand. But it wasn't Russian, or any dialect we had ever heard. We regrouped in the main hall, all of us on edge. The lights continued to flicker erratically, casting strange shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. The station felt alive now, like it was watching us. We decided to check the generator room, but what we found there only deepened the mystery. The generator was running, but it looked ancient, far older than the station itself. It was made of a dark, blackened metal, covered in the same strange symbols we'd seen etched into the walls. But there was something else. Something had been left behind. A hatch, hidden beneath a layer of ice, bolted shut with rusted locks, and next to the hatch, written in faded paint, were the words, "Do not open." We should have left then. We should have turned back. But curiosity got the better of us. We forced the hatch open. Beneath it was a ladder, descending into the darkness. A cold draft wafted up from below, carrying with it a smell unlike anything I had ever encountered, musty, damp, and faintly metallic. We descended slowly, one by one, our flashlights barely penetrating the black void beneath the station. At the bottom of the ladder was a tunnel, carved directly into the ice. It stretched on for what seemed like miles, the walls smooth and wet, as if they had been melted rather than dug. There were no signs of equipment, no indication that the tunnel had been created by human hands. And that's when we heard it. A low, distant sound, like the groaning of metal, but deeper, more primal. It echoed through the tunnel, making the very air vibrate. It wasn't natural. It couldn't be. As we moved deeper into the tunnel, the temperature continued to drop. Our breath hung in the air, freezing before it could even dissipate. The walls seemed to pulse with a faint glow, illuminating strange markings that looked almost organic, like the veins of some ancient creature buried beneath the ice. Then we found the door. It was massive, embedded in the ice itself, made of the same blackened metal as the generator. More symbols were etched into its surface, and the same warning, "Do not open." But the door had already been breached. The ice around it had been chipped away, and the heavy locks had been broken from the inside. Something had gotten out, and now it was free. Beyond the door was a chamber, vast, echoing, and filled with a strange mist that clung to the floor. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone structure, a monolith, covered in more of those strange, alien symbols. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, sending waves of energy through the air. But it wasn't the monolith that terrified us. It was what lay around it. The bodies were frozen, half buried in the ice, their faces twisted in expressions of pure horror. They weren't Soviet researchers. They were much older, centuries, maybe millennia old. Their clothing was unlike anything we had ever seen, made from strange materials that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. And then the whispers began. They were faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind outside, but they grew louder, more insistent, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. They filled the chamber, echoing off the walls, surrounding us. It wasn't Russian. It wasn't any language we knew, but somehow we understood. It was a warning, a plea. Leave, leave now. We turned to go, but it was too late. The air in the chamber grew colder, so cold it burned our skin. The mist around the monolith began to swirl, forming shapes, vague, indistinct figures that moved with a strange fluidity, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. They hovered just at the edge of our vision, never fully materializing, but we could feel them watching us. One of the team members, Anton, stepped closer to the monolith, his eyes wide and vacant, as if he were in a trance. We called out to him, tried to pull him back, but he didn't respond. He reached out and touched the surface of the stone. The room exploded with light. A scream tore through the air, Anton's scream, before it was abruptly cut off. When the light faded, he was gone. There was no trace of him, no sign that he had ever been there. The whispers returned, louder now, more frantic. Leave! Leave now! We ran. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around us as we scrambled back toward the surface. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frenzied. The ground beneath our feet shook, and the air was filled with a deep, resonant hum. The same hum we had heard when we first entered the station. When we finally reached the surface, the sky had darkened, the wind howling with a fury we hadn't experienced before. The lights in the station were flickering wildly, casting long, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. We didn't stop. We packed what we could, abandoned the rest, and left the station behind. As we drove away, the radio crackled with static, the same unintelligible voice we'd heard before. No one spoke during the journey back. No one dared. We reported our findings to the authorities, but they didn't believe us. The station had been wiped from records for a reason, they said. Whatever was out there, whatever had been uncovered, it was better left buried beneath the ice. But I can't forget what we saw. The whispers still haunt my dreams, and every time I close my eyes, I see the monolith pulsing in the darkness, hear the voices pleading for us to leave. Something is out there, in the frozen wasteland of the Russian tundra. Something ancient, powerful, and very, very dangerous. And it's only a matter of time before it wakes up again. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed what you've heard and want to hear more, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate your support.